In this video, we're going to see how we can use a Python program to access a database. We're going to be using a database that was created for SQLite, but you could use one for another relational DBMS as well. Most of the steps I'm going to show you will be the same, regardless of which DBMS you are using. Now, in SQLite, it's important that the database file, the SQLite file, be in the same folder as the Python program that you're going to use to access it. Then we need to import the necessary module. The name of that module is SQLite 3, and so we're going to begin the Python program with the line that you see here. Then we're going to connect to the database using a function called connect that is in the SQLite 3 module. And so we say SQLite3.connect, and then we give it the name of the database file. So for example, if we're connecting to the movie database that we've looked at in previous videos and that we used in some of the problem sets, we would pass in the name movie.sqlite as a string. And what this connect function gives me is an object that we're going to call a database handle. It provides a connection to the database, and we're taking that return value and we are assigning it to a variable. We're calling that variable db. And then once we have our database handle, we can go ahead and perform the query that we need to access the database. But it turns out you don't use the database handle itself. Rather, you take the database handle and you use a method inside it called cursor. And that method gives you back another object, which is also known as a cursor, and we assign that object to a variable. And I've used the name cursor for that as well. Then, once you have your cursor object, you're going to call a method inside that object called execute, and you're going to pass in the command, the SQL command, as a string. For example, I could pass in this select command, which extracts the name and rating of all movies in the database from the year 2013. And I've surrounded the query string with triple quotes. That allows me to have the string span multiple lines of my program, and that way I can line it up and make it readable. You can see I've put these initial steps into a Python program. If I go ahead and run this, you'll see that we don't get any output at all. And that's because executing a query does not actually show you the results. Python requires that you use the cursor to access the results, and that way you'll get one row at a time, and you can transform the result or print it however you want. One way to do this is using a method that's inside the cursor called fetch1. Fetch1 gives you back one row at a time from the results, and we assign that row to a variable. If there's nothing left from the results, you're going to get back a special value called none. You can see that I've added a call to fetch1 to our program. I'm storing the result in the variable row, and I'm printing the value of that variable. If I run this, you'll see that I get something that looks like this. And the combination of strings that I'm seeing is known as a tuple in Python. It's another type of sequence, so it's similar to a list, but unlike a list, we can't change its internals. It is not mutable. But just like with a list, I can access its components using indexing. So if I'm taking my tuple and assigning it to the variable row, then row 0 will give me the first component, which is the name of the movie, and row 1 will give me the second component, which is the rating. So let's go ahead and use indexing in our program. So rather than printing out the entire tuple, let's print out the first component, followed by a space, followed by the second component. If I now run it, you'll see we get this format. We can make it look a little bit nicer by adding in parentheses on either side of the rating, and we're going to use string concatenation for that. So now if I save it and I rerun it, you can see that the rating is surrounded by parentheses. Now fetch1 only gives me a single result, but there are other movies from that year. If I knew exactly how many movies there were, I could put all of this in a loop that looks like this. So let's say I know, or I think, that there are 4 movies from that year. I could say for I in range 4, so I'm going to get 4 repetitions, and then I just put both of these lines in the body of that loop. And so now if I run it, you'll see that we get 4 rows of results because we're calling fetch1 4 times. But it turns out there are more than 4 movies. So maybe we say, well, maybe there's 6. So we change range 4 to range 6. We resave it. We rerun it. Now I'm getting 6 results, but it turns out there's even more than that. And the problem is we don't know how many. And because we don't know how many, this type of loop, this simple repetition loop, is not going to work. Luckily, Python lets us do this instead. And you can see my for loop header now looks different. I'm using the variable row as my loop variable. And that loop variable is going to get 1 row at a time from the results of the query that we just executed using the cursor. Notice we do not need to say fetch 1. We can just say for row in cursor. And it's going to repeat as many times as we need it to based on how many rows are in the result. Let's go ahead and do that in our program. So again, we're going to use row as our loop variable. It's going to be drawing from the cursor. So we're treating the cursor as if it were a sequence. And then we can get rid of this call to fetch 1. We don't need it anymore. And then we can go ahead and run it. And now we'll see we get all of the results for that year. And it would repeat as many times as were needed, depending on how many rows were in the result. Now ideally, we'd like this program to be more flexible by allowing the user to specify which year they want the movies from. And so we would get a prompt that looks like this. Then the user would type in the year they want, so let's say 1976, and then we would see the results for that year. In order to get the year from the user, we're going to add an input statement. We're going to read this in as a string, so we're just going to use input. We don't need to use int input. We don't need to convert it to an int. And you can see I'm taking whatever I get back from input and I'm assigning it to the variable target year. And then the question is, how do we incorporate target year into our query? We want it to somehow replace 2013. The way we do that is using what's called a parameterized query. So in our query string, we're going to put a question mark where the year used to be. And that question mark is a placeholder. You can see I'm also taking my query string and I'm assigning it to a variable because we're going to use that variable when we execute the query. And what's going to happen is we're going to execute it by passing in the variable for the query string. And then in addition, we're going to pass in a list containing whatever should be plugged in to the placeholder. So in this case, it's just a single placeholder. So we have a single thing in the list. But in theory, you could have multiple things that you're plugging in. And we'll see that in lecture. When the query is executed, Python is going to take whatever value we give for the placeholder and plug it in place of the question mark. And so we'll get the year in the query. Okay, so again, we're going to take this query string. We're going to assign it to a variable. Let me line things up here. And then in place of the year, we're going to put our placeholder character, our question mark. And then when we execute the command, we're going to pass in the variable for the string, and then we're going to pass in a list containing whatever should be plugged into the placeholders. And again, there's only one here, so there's only one thing in the list. And now, if I go ahead and save this and run it, you can see if we enter 1976, we get the results for that year. If I run it again, and I say I want 2013, we'll get the same results that we saw earlier for 2013. And so now this is going to work for whatever year the user specifies.